an architecture media podcast supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today Lucia Amies, editor of ArchitectureAu, speaks with internationally renowned architect and recipient of the 2026 Royal Institute of British Architects Royal Gold Medal, Níall McLaughlin. But first, here's the latest news headlines from ArchitectureAu.
In the news this week, Australia is set to gain its first new Catholic cathedral in more than a century, with Níall McLaughlin Architects appointed to design a major new place of worship in the Sydney suburb of Waitara. Alongside the new cathedral, the 7.7 hectare precinct will encompass education and community facilities. In other Sydney news, the cutaway at Barangaroo has reached completion following a major fit-out that introduces purpose-built event spaces into the raw cavern beneath Barangaroo Reserve. The space now includes a main event hall, a pre-function area, gallery and exhibition rooms, a commercial kitchen, and green rooms and dressing rooms. And in Tasmania, a vision for the precinct surrounding Hobart's upcoming Macquarie Point Stadium has been released, showing the size and location of future development across the suburb, while two preferred proponents have been named to deliver the new $1.3 billion venue. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, April 21.
Níall McLaughlin established his London practice, Níall McLaughlin Architects, in 1990. Across 3 decades, his studio has refined its craft of elegant detailing and material exploration. This approach is evident in their work across myriad typologies and has framed Níall's belief that building is an act, not an object. With the announcement that Níall McLaughlin Architects are appointed to design a new Catholic cathedral in Sydney, Lucia Amies, editor of ArchitectureAu, sat down with Níall himself to discuss his studio's philosophy and approach.
Hi, Níall, and thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Lucia. Very nice to meet you.
I want to congratulate you on receiving the 2026 RIBA Royal Gold Medal. Huge achievement. You're currently travelling in Australia, so I felt like this would be a good opportunity to unpack some of the things you were awarded for and your approach to architecture, which to me feels like it's underscored by this idea of building as an act rather than as a static object. This idea of architecture kind of argues against an architect or any sole architect being the author of a building. Do you mind expanding a little bit on that philosophy?
I think there are two aspects to it. One of them, as I was reflecting a little bit on, let's say it's 2026 now, and I was thinking back to 100 years ago, 1926, and the sort of manifestos that are produced by the avant-garde at that time, and the idea of architecture that they're putting forward. And obviously it's not just a stylistic thing, but it's philosophical, technical, social. It's very embodied in a whole society, the way they think that architecture should be. And it seemed to me to privilege the sort of unique artifact produced by the individual author that was in a sense a masterwork. And in the word of the time, it was meant to sort of fulfill the zeitgeist, the spirit of that age, the spirit of that moment in time, as though history had a kind of emotive force to produce these kind of gems that fully summarize and embodied the particular nature of a given moment. And it struck me that particularly in relation to the demands of the climate emergency and our requirement to make buildings from low embodied carbon, and maybe most especially the increased emphasis on, because we're looking for low embodied carbon, of reusing existing building stock, that it somehow changes the paradigm in a way. And there's two things. The kind of materials that the heroes of the modern movement wanted to make were what I call igneous materials. They're steel, glass, concrete, requiring huge amounts of heat energy to produce them. And the kind of materials that we would perhaps privilege now are stone and wood, which are natural materials which have their own kind of history. I mean, they came into being through a history on the Earth's surface, and they carry the lineaments of that history and their material properties. But also they come attached to craft histories, the way that people have worked them over time. So the materials are not as though freshly minted. They come with a deep time attached to them. And when we think about working with existing buildings, we might think that the architect's task is not to invent something out of the innocence of their own minds, but to inherit something that they have taken from another architect, a building that already exists, to alter it, reimagine it, care for it, and then to pass it over in the future to some other architect who will hopefully continue that chain of communication and responsibility over time. And so I like that idea that we move away from the artifact, from the kind of unique object, and much more towards a process of care and tending, of initiation, alteration, improvement, and eventually the dissolution and recreation of buildings. And I find that much more fascinating as a way of thinking about architecture. And somehow it takes the heavy yoke of authorship off you and sees you as somebody who is part of a vertical community extending from the past into the future. I find that a much more interesting way of thinking about work.
Likewise, I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's a really appropriate paradigm for today, as you said, in an age where we kind of rethinking how we can be more circular with our buildings. You were recently announced as the architect of a new cathedral precinct in Sydney, and it seems to me that much of your work is actually around those kind of communal gathering spaces, cultural places, such as places of worship, education, and the like. I'm interested in how these kind of projects sit within, the world right now, where social cohesion seems to always be in flux, and I'd say at the moment is particularly fractured. Do you see your architecture as having a significant role to play in facilitating unity or shared understandings between people with different perspectives?
We say my architecture. I think you'd have to almost go back and say architecture itself. I mean, it's hard to think about architecture as belonging outside a model of community. Because I think that, one of the things that really interests me, I read and think about a lot, is the kind of origins of architecture in the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, when people started making buildings. And when I look at those projects and the archaeological reports on those projects, you discover quite interesting things about why people started making buildings at all. And I would say there are a couple of points I would make about them. The first houses are what the archaeologist Ian Hodder calls history houses. And he says that their purpose was not really shelter or to perform any particular task that couldn't have been performed without houses, but actually it was a way of creating a representation of deep time. And people did that by building the houses again and again and again on the same site, with the hearths above each other on the same site for thousands of years, and burying their dead beneath the floor. And he was saying that at that period in human history, there was a requirement, when communities were getting more complex and the kind of tasks they were carrying out had a longer time horizon, that there needed to be a way of representing what he calls temporal depth or deep time as a way of holding communities together. But if you think of that as being an abstract thing, it's not really, if we think of it in our contemporary time. A lot of institutions are like that. If you think of a university, for example, people who come into a university to work are coming into a group of buildings which already have a deep history, and therefore suggest that they're going to project into a further future. And you can contextualize your own engagement with that community in that moment to a deeper vertical engagement that occurs across time. So that sense of community building by representing communal bonds that have duration seems to me to be a very important vocation for architecture. And also in some of the earliest temples that were built, it seems as though the act of construction itself was almost more important than the completed artifact. And we were looking at these great stone circles in the north of Scotland, where the archaeologist who was dealing with them said, there's no finished monument they had in mind there. If you look at it, it's a continuous performance. They were constantly altering these things and moving elements around. And he was saying, why would a community living on the edge of the world put so much of their social capital into moving these huge stones around in a circle? And he said that it's probable that construction as an activity began to replace blood bonds at that time as a way of holding communities together. So when we build something for ourselves and invest so much of our labor and resources into it, we create bonds of mutual obligation, and that thing embodies and represents those bonds of mutual obligation. And the reason I say this complex thing is that I see at the moment, and particularly with the architectural community staring down the mouth of artificial intelligence and so on, technology will always give you better and better objects of a certain kind. And once you decide that your task is simply to make better and better objects of a certain kind, then you're in a losing battle against technology. And you've got to actually re-envisage what your task is. And in my view, the primary task of architecture is not simply to make shinier and newer and brighter and more sophisticated objects. It's an engagement between communities and makers. It's a form of material practice that embodies their communal bonds. And I'm sure we feel the kind of fragmentation and isolation that modernity produces and that technology under capital produces is a condition that we're used to now, this sense of being in strange little bubbles not quite communicating with each other. The grounding of communities is not just in the buildings themselves and the activities in those buildings, but in the communal act of making those buildings. And I think there's a way of reinvigorating architecture through that paradigm, because a really great building is not just a perfect little object. It's actually something that has brought in and drawn a community into its making, its initiation, its use, and its care over time. That's what architecture should be, and its primary purpose is to bind us together.
That's, I think, really thoughtful. It does make me think, there's quite a job for the architect in bringing together, facilitating that kind of process, that community to make the building together. You have teams of people coming together, and that's just in your office. But then obviously there's also what happens through the process of, bringing in stakeholders from community and also the builder and consultants and all of these different inputs into making your architecture. Is there kind of a democratic approach to how the design resolves itself, or how do you navigate the tensions?
I mean, it's a certain kind of democracy. I'd love to say that we all sit around and have completely equal say and that everything ends up being something that we have full consent around. It's more complex than that. I would describe it as a kind of collegiate community. I very rarely design by myself. And I would also say that design, there are no projects that we're involved in that I'm not involved in the design of. So I have a particular role in that, which I would have thought is like the conductor of an ensemble or something, that you're facilitating and directing a conversation that's happening between a number of parties who are bringing different interests into it. And I'm very interested in structuring those conversations and allowing people's voices to kind of bubble up. And in the office, the thing that I'm most concerned about is for people to feel that they can be brave enough to put ideas out there, and whether they're accepted or rejected, that they feel that even putting the ideas out there is part of the conversation. So the way those conversations are facilitated and developed in the office is something that I think about a lot. And even with client groups and builders, in my ideal world, it's something that you're drawing people in and saying, what have you got to give to the project, or how can you communicate to the project? We were having a terrific conversation yesterday afternoon with our engineers, Arabs in Sydney, about the new building that we're designing. And the dialogue between the engineers and the architects is just so interesting to see how, when you open the room and give every voice its chance to engage with this subject, how the subject begins to move around through dialogue around the table. And I see my role more than anything else as facilitating and supporting those dialogues so that we get to a point where there's a sense that the project almost knows how it wants to go forward itself.
In Australia, and I presume it's the same in the UK, if not everywhere, architects at the moment are facing increasing legal risks, and, our roles are being diminished, or our responsibilities diminished, maybe. I don't know if that resonates with you, but at least I see architects in Australia having less and less of a role in building and making on site, or just being involved on site, maybe because of cost reasons, not just legal reasons. Is that something that sounds true to you as well, or have you had that issue, and do you think that's kind of detrimental to the architecture profession to not be involved in making in such a direct way?
I mean, that's a very good question, but it's also a very complex one. I would begin by saying that every building project since we started as a species to make buildings, one of the key factors in that has been management of risk. And we think of it as being a modern phenomenon, but there's an extraordinary standing stone in Normandy, which is lying on the ground and it's broken into 3 pieces. And they thought it might have taken 3 generations to bring it to the place where it snapped. And so when it happened, it would have been a societal catastrophe that happened. And buildings always carry with them risks which are out of proportion to the resources of a society at a time. And we had this thing recently with the HS2 railway line in the UK that it was almost bankrupting the country. Now, not every building is like that, but even somebody designing their own house, the amount of money they're spending is the most money they'll ever spend in their whole lives. So risk is a kind of dangerous commodity in building projects. And the way that we've done it in the modern age is very typical of modernity, is that we have bundled it up and turned it into a commodity. And we've isolated risk, and we've said, here's risk, which is this dangerous thing that the person who's in commissioning the building wants to sell to the lowest possible bidder. And that's how capitalism works. It turns it into a commodity, and that commodity then gets shifted around in the market. And architects are simply players in that market. Now, typically in the modern age, that risk is being bought by contractors from the client at the lowest cost. They're tendering to buy that risk and to take that risk for the client. And in a situation like that, managed by project managers, architects are tending to get pushed out of that, because the architect themselves, with their kind of liberal aspirations and so on, are seen as being an aspect of risk rather than a solution to risk. And so a lot of risk is then being transferred to architects through the contracts. And it's architects' contracts seem to be very sticky when it comes to risk compared to other consultants. And so a lot of it is aggregating into the architects' contracts, and the professional bodies are really struggling to manage that. At the same time, and I can't speak for Australia because I just don't know enough about it, but certainly in the US and the UK, you have this equal and opposite thing where architecture education is moving away from technical mastery towards, in a broad sense, an education in values. And that's partly to do with the fact that a lot of people who are now teaching in architecture schools are coming from academic disciplines in the humanities rather than coming in their muddy boots from building sites. And so the sense of students being taught by people who are grounded in the material practice of making buildings in real time, that's not happening so much anymore. And you have this sense, certainly in the schools that I teach in, where an awful lot of the people who teach there have never been on a building site. And the key thing they're doing is teaching the students how to embody values like global justice, climate equity, and so on. And that's all very well. But as a builder that I spoke to recently, the head of a building company I spoke to recently, he said, the problem with you architects is you're all values and no effing skills. And so what's happening is you're getting architects trained up into a profession where they feel that their primary task is to embody values, and being pushed out into a market where, in a sense, what it's really looking for is technical skills to land the project at the lowest risk. And I think that's a real problem for architecture. My own sense is that you can't acquire values except through skills. And I think that there needs to be a grounding in architecture schools where students are taught to realize that this is a specific form of material practice with its own limitations and its own possibilities, and the values that you apply to it must be values that it can hold in terms of its identity as a skilled material practice. And to me, the disaggregation of those two things is extremely risky for the architectural profession, which has its own problems in the market anyway.
Yeah, that's very true. It's making me think a little bit of some projects where risk might be, more heightened, like competition projects, for instance. So you've won quite a few competitions. How do they play out when you've got a vision for a project and you're trying to kind of get everyone on board with that vision, but no one really yet knows how it's going to come together? How do you not sell that, but get everyone to the table to kind of see that is possible and worthwhile?
It's a funny one. I was out having dinner last night with an architect, and he was telling me that 95% of their work is through ongoing referral, and that they simply get projects from other clients or from clients who they've done good work for previously, and that's the way that they work. I'm the exact opposite. About 90% of our work comes through competitions. And it's an interesting treadmill to be on in a way, because you have this bookending of most of your projects, that it has to be won through a competition. And if you want to get onto the next competition shortlist, it has to win an award. So it's almost like a kind of a professional sporting team or something. You just have to keep winning in order to survive, in order to stay in the market. And it produces a certain kind of high adrenaline dynamic. And on a personal level, I'd say I sometimes find that quite difficult, because in a way, your vocation is to speak to people, hear them, understand what they want, and over time together in dialogue to create a building with your client, with your builders and so on, that will suit its purpose, and people will, and then to take pleasure in watching that as a lived experience. And instead you're in this kind of high octane environment where you're going off and doing a big presentation here, and it's kind of win or bust mentality all the time, which I think it does produce innovation, and it's produced some of our best buildings, so it has its merits, but it can also be quite wearing. And I think the thing you have to do in each instance is you have to find a way of very carefully reading the brief And the unusual thing is that you're getting a written document and perhaps maybe one briefing. And then you've got an enormous amount of second guessing to do to say what a committee of people on the jury are going to make of the pitch that you throw at them in the space of an hour on a particular day. And so that's a whole skill in itself. It's a kind of a certain amount of focusing and bringing things very quickly to the boil to allow people to imagine a possible world when you realize that a lot of the underpinning of that world couldn't possibly exist because you simply haven't had the dialogue to create it. And sometimes you get very well written briefs and you can find a way into that brief. And it's very satisfying to think that's so well written that I've been able to read the client's mind through their ability to communicate. And I can pick up that strand and say it back to them through the building in a way that they'll feel that they've been listened to. Sometimes that works, but sometimes we get it hopelessly wrong as well. And you're looking at a competition jury and you think, I'm not connecting with these people at all. And so you have to find a way of contextualizing that. For me personally, but also if you have a team, I've got about 25, 30 people in the office. And if we're doing competitions, it's win, lose, 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 win, win, win. And you've got to keep everybody sustained through that because if you've worked and put your heart and soul into a project to get it to a competition deadline, and then 3 weeks later you hear it wasn't for you, it's quite I've been doing it for 40 years, and every time it's still quite a blow,
Yeah, quite crushing.
Just to keep the show on the road with that is quite a challenge.
Well, I think we probably only have time for a last question, and that is, what's something you've changed your mind about?
The thing I remember changing my mind about, which is interesting, is that up until 2 weeks before I went to university, I was going to study English. And I had English literature down on the university form on my top list of 10 preferences, and I had architecture at number 10. And they have a little process called the change of mind form, which you could fill out at the last minute for 17-year-olds who haven't quite found their way in the world. And I was walking through Trinity College Dublin late at night, and I looked up at the Boland Library, which is a building from the 1960s, and a beautiful building by ABK in Dublin. And I remember it was night time and it was raining, and I was looking up, and I suddenly thought that the building was communicating to me in some way. I'd never really thought about buildings before at all. I had no connection to architecture, but I suddenly found it very mysterious, as though it was communicating to me in a subsonic or subliminal way. And I found something really compelling about it, and I thought, you could do architecture. So the next day, I think 2 days before the course started, I went in and flipped from doing English to doing architecture. So that was a change of mind that completely changed the rest of my life.
Wow.
And which I don't regret, I have to say.
No, I'm sure not. I think we're all happy that you did change your mind.
You've missed my great novel, that's all.
Maybe soon to come. You can always change your mind again. Well, thanks, Níall, for your time today.
Really nice to talk to you, Lucia.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture.